All right, let's open up a new document. And hopefully it remembered my paste or my copy. Nope. So just working with a blank document, I'll show you some of the basics of working with the pen tool. And again, if you guys are familiar with it, it will be fairly more review, but again, it works a little bit differently than it does in Illustrator. There's a couple different little quirks. But generally, creating any kind of shapes or objects in InDesign with a pen tool, you have your pen tool here. You'll see if you hold down underneath, you have some more options which we'll go over in a minute. You can add anchor points, delete anchor points, or you can convert direction point or convert anchor points from straight anchors to curved anchor points. So all paths are made up of points and line segments. So to start any kind of path, you start by just clicking once and you have your first anchor point. And then if you just move the mouse without holding or dragging or anything and just click another time, it creates a line segment between the 2 points, and it creates a straight line segment, basically just the shortest distance between those 2 points. So if you click and just keep clicking that way, you'll see it just creates straight line segments joining the 2 points. If you want to create a curved line, what you do is on the next line, here I'll start a different one. Let's deselect, go back to my pen tool. So if you want to select create a curved line, you would click once to establish your end point, your first end point, and then when I'm going to hold, well, no, I'm just going to line it up with the other one. So when I'm clicking, I'm holding the mouse now, and then you drag, and when you start to drag, you get these curve handles to adjust your curve, and then you have a curved line. And you can adjust those later by using your direct select tool and then adjusting those curved handles. What ends up happening a lot is generally, if you're not used to the pen tool, it can be very tricky to use. It takes sometimes it takes some timing as well. So going from just clicking, a lot of times people will click and just automatically drag, and then you're creating all these crazy lines, and then can't figure out why you don't have any straight lines. I'm just going to delete these. So again, if you want to create straight lines, you're just clicking, and that's it. And when you want to close your shape, let's say this funky shape, we're going to close it up. So we have an open, any line segments like this with an open endpoint just basically means that it's exactly how it sounds. It's an open segment. And when you go back to your original anchor point, you see you got that, I'll undo, you get that little circle that pops up just to show you that you're back at your original endpoint. And then you click that, and now you have a closed path. Basically the difference between the visual difference, I'll leave this one open. The visual difference between an open path and a closed path is going to be when you fill it. And you'll see, let me make my stroke a little bit bigger so you can see it. The stroke will only affect line segments or paths. It doesn't affect this open. It still fills the space because we're using vectors here, right? Like for vector graphics, so it's filling the space between all of these vectors. But it's not here. The difference is it's not putting a stroke on this end here as opposed to this end, because this is a closed path versus an open path. There are times you would use open paths like this. And obviously there's most times you use a closed path. Anytime you use, just as a side note, anytime you use your shape tools here, it automatically creates closed paths because it's a shape. So it's creating this circular closed path. And you can convert it to an open path just by deleting one of the anchor points, which we can get into later. So it's basically just an unconnected end where a closed path, all the paths are connected, and it's a solid shape. So let me delete these. Adding anchor points and deleting anchor points. Actually, let me go back to that. I'll undo. I will delete this one. We'll grab this shape. Adding anchor points or deleting anchor points. Actually, we'll go to, pardon my messing around here. I'm just going to make a square. Adding, modifying, or deleting anchor points is really easy. We'll go with modifying first. So you can use your direct selection tool, and this is with any shape, any path, any anchor point. Use your direct selection tool, and you want to select just the path that you want to modify. And this is where it works pretty much exactly the same as Illustrator. And you can move those anchor points around to create more complex shapes. And you can roughly transform a square into a more odd shape. Oops, I just moved the whole thing. So just by grabbing the anchor points themselves, or you can grab just the line segment, and now you're moving, basically it's changing the angle here and here, but we're moving this whole line segment in between these 2 points. So you can modify any kind of shape, whether you drew it with a pen tool or whether you drew it with your shapes tool. You can modify any shape just by direct selecting either the anchor points or the line segments. You can also add and delete anchor points. So we have our add anchor point tool, which is basically the pen tool with a little plus sign there. And let's say we want to add an anchor there. It gets a little finicky. You have to be like right on the line. And let's add another one there. So now you can see if I go back to my direct selection tool, now we have 2 more anchor points on this line. And we basically essentially kind of like broke up that one line segment into a couple different line segments by adding those points. And if you want to get rid of a point, generally if you're on the pen tool, oh no, it's not going to do it now. If you're on the add anchor point tool, let's see, usually if you hover over it, now it's not going to do it. If you hover over it, it usually converts into a delete anchor point, but we'll just go directly to our delete anchor point tool. And you basically just do the same thing. Instead of adding the anchor point, you're deleting that anchor point. And what that will do is you'll see it will basically, it doesn't leave, it's convenient because it doesn't leave an open endpoint, just like you could simply, I'll just show you, like you could delete that anchor point and it does a similar thing. It basically gets rid of the paths in between those points, but it leaves you with an open path rather than keeping a closed path. So if we were to use our delete anchor point tool, it deletes the anchor and does the same thing. You'll see it just takes the shortest route between the 2 paths, but it's kept the shape closed. So that's the reason that you would use the delete anchor tool rather than just deleting it with a direct selection, because a direct selection will actually essentially break your closed shape there. And then you can also convert, which I use here and there. You can convert your anchors to from straight to curved just by what I did with the convert anchor is I just clicked and I dragged. Or if you go back, if it's a straight anchor, let's say we want these to be curved, and you can adjust later. You're clicking and holding, and then you get these resize handles. So let's say we want this to be sort of more of a domed, odd bread loaf shape there. And then you can adjust. You're just clicking and dragging in it, and it turns it into your curved anchor, and now you have these adjustment handles. Or, for argument's sake, if you had started with a curved shape and you want to go to a straight, you just click on it, and there's no adjustments really to be done there because you're converting it from curved to straight. And again, similarly to getting rid of the using the minus anchor point, it just takes the shortest route between the 2 points. Where I've used the convert relatively frequently, it's something more like this, where you have like a circle and you want to convert that, and then you can adjust later and turn it more into a teardrop kind of thing. It's a relatively, or a water droplet. It's a relatively simple way to create like a water drop kind of effect, because you know you're starting with a nice smooth circle, and then you're just converting that anchor point. So what it's doing is, since these are all curved anchor points except for this one, it's creating that the only adjustment points, you'll see it adjust it slightly here, but the main adjustment points are with the bottom of the curve there. So it's just a nice way to like create like a quick water droplet kind of thing. But if I'm working with more elliptical shapes, and you want to create, you know, a shape like this, that's where it's super handy to just start with a circle and use that convert anchor point again. And I just clicked on it once just to give it the path, the shortest routes from this path, shortest curved routes. And then going to my direct select tool, all I did was drag that straight up a little bit, and I mean, you can refine it a little bit, but now we have a nice quick sort of liquid drop effect. So that's one of the really handy things you can use the convert anchor tool for. Or if you accidentally make a mistake when you're drawing, you can either, and if you, which I do a lot, like if you're drawing, I don't know, I'm just going to draw some arbitrary stuff. If you're drawing and, you know, you go from here and you've made that one straight and you don't want it straight, but you've gone, let's say you've gone more steps than that, you've gone sort of too far, you would undo too much work over here, you can convert this anchor point instead of trying to undo or delete or just redraw your shape entirely. So let's say we wanted to make that one curved, you know, and now we have another curve. Rather than having to go back a bunch of steps and undo all of your work. With curves and straight lines, this is where it gets kind of tricky with timing, I guess, and clicking and holding versus clicking and dragging or not clicking. You know, this is where it can get kind of tricky, and the pen tool honestly takes a lot of practice. It's relatively simple at first, but it is kind of tricky to use. So let's say we're going, I'm making straight. When you're making straight lines, going back to the point to define where you want to curve doesn't exist obviously when you're doing straight lines. But when we start making curves, so you see, let's say we want to have a nice curve this way, and then we want to basically have that same arc go the opposite way. If you start making another line, there we go, and you'll see where we have the different adjustment points here. So if we start adjusting, oops, it helps if I actually grab it. This is also where it takes a little bit of practice. If we start adjusting here, we're adjusting both of those curves. Now if we were to go back, I just undid a couple steps. So we drew this curve, right? If I go back to this curve and just click on it again to sort of define it, and then go back, theoretically, I don't know if I went back enough, it should act more independently. Let's go back a couple steps. It's usually when you have like curves, so I'm starting with this line. There we go. And generally, you can kind of adjust. It still affects this curve a little bit, but there we go. So now we can kind of adjust these curves a little more independently. When you're clicking, when you go back, I know that was kind of like convoluted there, but so let's go back another couple steps again. There we go. So basically when we're going back, I'm just going to click here to reestablish my point or my line segment. So again, we have this curve, and if we just continue to draw, it's going to give us those multiple adjustment points, like adjustment handles from this one point. And if you want to have the a single adjustment point, there's reasons to have both. There's reasons to have 2 adjustment points versus 1 adjustment point, and you'll see once you get more into detail drawing rather than these sort of arbitrary shapes that I'm making. So if you want to have the 2 adjustment points, you just kind of continue to draw as you normally would. And when you adjust, I'll just do that same thing. And you'll see when you adjust your curve, when you adjust this point, you have the 2 adjustment points here, and it's also showing you the angle here. So it's adjusting, like consider that it's kind of like this entire curve is sort of attached or codependent. So if you were to go, I'm just reestablishing my, if you wanted the curves to behave independently, what you need to do is again just click once on that last endpoint, just to sort of, it basically establishes it as an independent, it'll establish the next one as an independent curve. And then again, you're just clicking and holding like you normally would. And now you've sort of established these as 2 independent curves. So you'll see when we click on our adjustment points, now when we adjust, no matter how much we adjust this curve stays independent from this curve. Does that make sense? I know that's probably the most complicated concept to explain about the pen tool.
Do that by clicking on that anchor point.
Yep.
And then going to make the other anchor.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. The ways to make basically the ways to make curve segments independent of each other is just to click one time on that last point. Yeah. So I'm just going to click one time here, and then we can draw a crazy curve here. And then again, going back, I'm clicking on that one last point. And then now you'll see all of these curves, because I just went back and checked. Oh, I didn't do that one, but now these sort of behave independently. As we're changing this one, it's not changing the angle of this one. And as we're changing this one, since we clicked that last point and defined it as independent, it's not changing the angle or the curve of this one, right? And again, there's reasons to use segments that aren't dependent versus dependent. It's just going to depend on basically what shape you're drawing or what kind of graphic you're creating with those curves. And generally, like I said, it takes a lot of practice. It's just getting used to using the pen tool and creating graphics with the pen tool. Largely, when I'm working with curves, generally It's just kind of the way I work. You guys, again, will develop your own workflow in time. Generally, I usually establish all of my curves as independent. I just find it easier to work with that way. What ends up happening is I end up with more adjustment points, but I find it easier to adjust my curves independently of each other. It's just the way I work. I'll show you. The chapter does go over. Actually, let me do a rectangle here. The chapter does go over stroke features. It refreshes sort of, so the stroke is like the border, this border of a path, and you can change the color of the stroke and the weight. We all know this one already. You can change that weight or change the color as we normally would. If I actually click one, there we go. What you can also do is, I know I showed you quickly earlier in the semester, there's different stroke options in InDesign than there are in Illustrator. You have your thick and thin, too thin with more space in between them, hatches, etc. You can do dotted, or you can do dashed lines. And when you do dashed lines, you can also customize the dash and the gap between the dashes up to 3 places, and then it repeats. This doesn't show up. It can be kind of confusing when you use it. This doesn't show up until you select. So let's go back to solid. You'll see that gap thing kind of goes away. So those gap options don't show up until you actually select the dashed option. I don't know why it does that. In Illustrator, you'll see, or if you're used to Illustrator, this is always that gap and dash is always there. It's just grayed out if you can't use it. So I don't know why they kind of, whatever. So if you don't see it, it's just because you don't have that dash selected. But, so right now it's just set up at a 12 point dash, and generally about a 12 point gap, and just repeats. So let's say you wanted to do a little bit of, let's do our first dash is a 6 point, and you'll see it changes, and then we'll do a 6 point gap, and then a 12, and a 12, and then back to a 6 and a 6. And you'll see it kind of does this odd sort of Morse code looking dot dot dash thing. So you can adjust, and even if we wanted to, let's get rid of these so it's a little bit more even. So now you see the gaps. So we have our 6 point, 12 point, 12 point, 6 point, 6 point. Again, it takes a little bit of practice to get used to it, but or you can set all your gaps the same and just have your dashes be different. So now you see the spacing between the dashes is a little bit is the same. Visually, it might look a little different just because the dashes are different sizes. So if you wanted to do some sort of crazy custom, even if you wanted to do, let's keep that at 6, and we'll do a 3 point dash and a 6 point. If you wanted to have a more custom dot and dash, or dash and gap pattern, you can create custom patterns just by using that, using those options within that stroke panel. And again, that only shows up. We'll go back to any of the other options. Those dash and gap options only show up when you select your dotted line, and then it will go back to the default there. That can come in handy when using more, when we create more illustrative things, or if you wanted to have, I don't know, if you had a line segment with like an arrow pointing to something and you wanted to have a more sort of funkier looking dashed line, or there's various reasons why you would use that. You can also adjust, when you adjust the gaps, if you don't like the way, again, if you, just to show you really fast, if you don't like the way that, oops, that's twice. There we go. If you don't like the way that these like this corner works nicely, but let's say you had a different, I don't know, arbitrarily I'll put like 19. If you didn't like the way that this corner was set up, you can kind of adjust. Like sometimes when you have, I don't know, like I'll adjust client work a lot. So sometimes when you have, you know, like these aren't exactly even. If I drop down a guide, I don't know what they are, they just don't look even. If for whatever reason you didn't like the way, if you had a, here, let's go to, and then we'll do 12 and 12. So if you didn't like the way that these were, you know, if, let's say you got graphics from somewhere and you wanted to adjust these dashes, you wanted to adjust the spacing a little bit, you can adjust them with the gaps here, and it makes your dot pattern or your dash pattern a little bit more even. A lot of times I'll end up using that feature when I'm adjusting either artwork that I've gotten from somewhere, either a client or, I don't know, a download or a graphic that already existed. I'll generally use that to readjust client artwork or someone else's artwork. This is a refresher. They talk a little bit about our stroke options, the different joins that we have. Either the rounded join, I'll zoom in so we can see it. Our rounded joins versus our miter joins. Aligning the stroke. I know I've gone over this a little bit before. I'll set this to a color so you can see it. That's pretty obnoxious. Right now the stroke is aligned to the center of the line, so the stroke kind of comes into our shape a little bit. So we can align that stroke to the inside. So now here's our path and the stroke is on the inside. Or you can align it to the outside of the stroke, or the outside of the path rather, so that it basically doesn't take any space away from your original object. I know I've gone over that before. When you have, let me get rid of that ridiculous color. When you have an open path, this is where your caps come in. You can have your rounded cap or projecting cap. I know I've gone over this a little bit. The projecting cap is, I was trying to get too obnoxious with color. The projecting cap goes just beyond, so like the endpoint would be here, so it goes just beyond the endpoint. And there's illustrative reasons why you would do that. Of course, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there's reasons why you would use, you know, let's say you had, you know, another shape on top of this one, and you wanted that to project a little bit further than that shape. You could choose that projecting end cap. These are the kind of things I know I've gone over earlier, but and then the rounded cap versus the blunt cap is going to be different than your joins. So right now we have our cap at rounded, but our join is still set at a miter join. So if you want everything to sort of have a round appearance, you want to make sure that you have that rounded join and a rounded cap. Those are two different things. So even if you had, you know, again, if you had this open end cap, just as it normally shows up, and you want it to be rounded, and you select your join and hit that rounded join, and it doesn't affect this, it's because these two paths are not joined. So if you have two open paths, or if you have an open path that you want to join, it's pretty simple to do. You basically just select with the direct selection tool. I'm just holding shift, and you're selecting the two paths that you basically want to connect, and under object paths you hit join, and now it closes those back up, and then you can see it applies that rounded join to your object. In Illustrator there's a shortcut for it. In InDesign there's not. So if you're used to Illustrator and you're looking for the shortcut in InDesign or it's not working, that's why. It's under object paths and join, and you can connect two open end paths, and they will connect. Lastly, I'll show you. I know we've worked with this a little bit. Oh, not lastly, but I know we've worked a little bit with this last semester, or if you guys are familiar with it, it'll be a little bit of a review. But working with the pathfinder tool I use a lot. It's a really nice way to create more complex shapes using the basic shapes that we have. Let me back out just a little bit. So if you wanted to create, let's say we create a large square, and I'll grab my ellipse here. Oops. There we go. And then I'll roughly center those. And I'll make one pink and one red, let's say. And then I'll get rid of the stroke on both of them. Okay. The Pathfinder tool basically will allow you to create more complex shapes using more than one shape. It comes in handy when you want to create, again, more complex paths. And there's a variety of different things you can do. You can add, which when you hover over them, it gives you the descriptions. It basically combines the shapes that you have selected into one solid shape. So now you see we no longer have two independent shapes here. We have one solid shape. Where this comes in handy a lot professionally, where I see it a lot, is when you have something that's, someone's created a graphic like this, let's say. They want this kind of, or even, I know I'm getting too nitpicky with this, but let's say they want to create sort of a tombstone-ish looking object. And like visually, if you didn't see the edges, visually that looks like one solid shape, right? It's red on red and no problem. When you're printing, generally that wouldn't be a problem if you're printing with an inkjet or something like that. If you're printing on a 4-color process doing separations, where it lays down the ink, it might shift, or where you're doing those color steps, you might have a little bit of shift between the two objects, or you run that risk. Definitely when you're outputting to vinyl, to a plotter, which is basically a printer with a knife on it, the plotter is going to cut anywhere there is an overlap. So even though that this is red on red, a plotter basically will see this and it'll cut here, 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 and here. So even if you wanted this red solid shape, or this shape to appear solid, if you cut this out, if you had this output in vinyl, it would be technically 3 different shapes. And then if you're putting it on something, you run the risk of having it shrink or expand or whatever, and then you end up with gaps. So specifically for outputting to vinyl is where I use it a lot, is where I do this combine feature, and now the shape is just this tombstone-y outline. That's where I find the tool to be most handy. There's other options if you wanted to subtract. It basically subtracts the front objects from the back objects, you'll see. So then it'll create this nice curve. Intersect, which basically just leaves this section that intersects. It gets rid of all the, so where the overlap is, it basically gets rid of it. So you kind of see that. Exclude overlap is kind of exactly how it sounds. It excludes all of the overlapping pieces. And then minus back just gets rid of whatever is behind. So this is where object ordering will help. So it gets rid of, since this object is on top of this one, it got rid of everything from the overlap. There we go. It got rid of everything from the overlap and behind it. I find these really handy. A lot of times when I'm creating logos, or I need to make more complex shapes, things like that. I'm trying to think. Like, I did a logo that was like a crest kind of logo, so that helped create. I used multiple shapes to create this custom looking crest. Things like that. I find the pathfinder super handy. And it also, if you wanted to, for InDesign purposes, if you wanted to fill a shape like this, if you wanted to create a more complex shape and sort of fill this tombstone shape with an image, you would have to combine it, and then you can fill the entire shape, with one image, rather than trying to. I've seen a lot of times where people try to place the same picture into two different objects and kind of like line them up, which rarely works out. So this will give you, like, if you wanted to do, I don't know, you had an illustration that this was like a custom window or something like that. Now you have this custom shape that you can apply graphics into, just like any other frame or shape that we have. I find it super handy to use. We'll throw that aside. And lastly, we'll go over some basic text effects, like type on a path. If you've worked with it before in almost any program, it should be relatively familiar. The one thing that InDesign does that most programs don't, which is actually pretty handy once you get used to it, when you use your type on a path, which is, so if you click and hold, it's underneath your type tool, and you basically just pick the path that you want to type onto, and you'll see when you go over it, you get this plus sign, and then you just click, and then you get your cursor on that path. So that's type on a path. So what this does, like I said just now, what InDesign does or doesn't do, I guess, that most programs do, is when you select a path to type on, I know Illustrator does this a lot, when you select a path to type on, it gets rid of any kind of fill or stroke information, because it converts that path into just a text or a type path, where InDesign doesn't do that, which can either be handy or annoying depending on how you look at it. I actually find it fairly handy. So if you're used to Illustrator sort of getting rid of that stroke or fill as you type, you just need to know, like, if you don't want that default fill there, you can just get rid of it, and then now it's showing the outlines, but now you won't see any kind of like print or anything like that. It doesn't have any color. To adjust type on a path works similarly to most. There we go. To most illustrating programs, definitely similar to Illustrator. Kind of like all of our text blocks or our text frames, you have your import and output. So when you hover over them, this is where it gets kind of finicky and tricky because the guides aren't exactly great sometimes. So sometimes this can take a little practice too. So you have, if I hover over them, you'll see that's our output, because that little tiny arrow at the bottom there is pointing to the right. And then if I can hover over it just right, they put them really close. That's the import. So if you wanted these to adjust a little bit more, of course, did I do the wrong one? Of course I did. So this is our, oops, this is where it gets finicky even for me. So we'll throw our output here, and then our import here, and you'll see, since this is left justified rather, the text left justified to that import side. So if we wanted this to stay at the center of the top of the circle, let's say, you just need to go back into your text tool, select it and center, and then now it's on top of our circle. So if you wanted it like dead center in the top of the circle, now we know our in and our out ports are right at the centers of the circle, and then you hit the center, the justify center, and now we know that type sits perfectly in the center of our circle. You have a couple of options with type on a path. if you go under type and type on a path and options, you'll see the default, it's previews checked. The default is this rainbow, which basically just kind of follows the curve or the path that you're typing on. Honestly, in my experience, I don't use these other effects too much. I've used the skew once or twice. It really just kind of looks like, obviously, it looks like it sort of arcs the text back a little bit. The 3D ribbon, I'll just show you these. Stair step. Stair step you might use occasionally, but you can kind of see, I don't know, personally you can kind of see why you wouldn't really use these very often. Again, skew, rainbow, 9 times out of 10. Skew I've used once in a while. It depends on the text. It depends on the project. What I use a lot is where to align the text to. So right now, and as a default, it aligns the baseline to your path. And you'll see here our baseline is right on the path where you have your descenders come below the path. You can have it aligned to your descender. So there's obviously a character that's a little bit lower than these. Generally a J or something like that. Can be a little lower, so it's aligning to the descender. Or you can have it aligned to the ascender, which will align it to the top. And you'll see it kind of like, depending on where you position the type, like you see now it's kind of squished it. The kern is really tight, so you might need to, depending on how you adjust these, you might need to adjust your kerning or your tracking a little bit. Definitely in the assignment you need to. Or a lot of times what I do is I'll align center. I'll either do baseline or center, generally, in my experience. I find it most useful to either have it aligned to the descender, or the baseline, sorry, or the center. That's what I was thinking. So we'll hit OK. And now it's aligned to the center of your text. And again, this obviously isn't optically center, because you see it's kind of, some of these are lowercase, so it goes through a little bit of the top. It's going to align, it's aligning to the center of the character. So the overall, it uses whatever the overall height between the lowest descender and the highest ascender. So that's why it kind of looks a little bit funky from, like the T, it's pretty much almost dead center, and then the H, it's just about center, and then the path, obviously, or the P rather, it looks like it's way lower, but it's optically center, not. You might need to cheat a little bit if this is where, with any kind of text adjustments, this is where we might cheat a little bit, adjust that kerning, adjust that, rather to make it optically center than technically center. Let's go back to baseline. Adjusting text, again, can be a little bit finicky, because you see there's a tiny guide here where we have these ports. So this is the center of our text, and there's a little sort of like upside down T to show you the center. You'll see it more on your machines. It's a little bit hard to see there, but as we hover over it, you'll see we get that text shift icon, and you'll see that. Can you kind of see above my mouse there, that light blue? So this is going to adjust where that center point is on the path. So let's say we move it over here, and you'll see now we've adjusted it a little bit to the left. Or let's say we want it to line up with the center of the side. And now you see how the text flipped there. I kind of did that on purpose. When you're adjusting, you'll see that little blue line is on the outside of the circle. So that's going to keep my text on the outside there. Or if you wanted to, oops, this is where it gets a little bit tricky even for me. So let's say we wanted to align that text to the center left side of this circle, but we wanted the text to be on the inside of the circle. You'll see how that line kind of jumps from side to side. Now it's on top of the circle there, and then now it's on the inside. Again, you'll see that a little bit more on your machines. This is again where adjusting text gets a little bit tricky, because those guides could be a little bit better And now you'll see the text is on the inside. It's just basically flipped that text to the inside. Oops. So if you wanted, let's say you wanted that bottom, this text on the bottom, center on the inside of your line versus the outside of your line, it's going to flip it upside down because it's going to run it from the start. It's basically going to look at like, kind of like this is the starting point and then coming around to the end. So it's going to treat this as upside down. That's why a lot of times I'll have, let's undo that. There we go. I'll align it to the center of the circle, but then I'll go to my type, and this is why a lot of times I'll have it type on a path. I can't talk and select at the same time. This is where a lot of times I'll have it aligned to the center. So this way, when you adjust that to the outside or the inside, it's always going to be on center. So you don't have to worry about, like you have to worry about it flipping, but you don't have to worry about it being on the inside or the outside of the circle. It's always on the center line of your object. That's why generally I have a tendency to, especially if it's going to be on an ellipse or a circle of some sort, I'll align the type to sit on the center of the path, just because I find it easier to adjust when you have something on the top and the bottom. If you had type, let's copy this. If you had type on a more complex shape or a more complex path, you'll see how it handles very differently. And this is where you might need to adjust. This is where you might need to adjust your kerning and tracking, because you see how, not that it necessarily arbitrarily does your adjustments, but you can see where it kind of cut off our, I wanted to highlight that, cut off our type. And you basically move everything. Let's get rid of that fill. You basically move it the same way. Oops. You basically move it the same way as you would with, there we go, there's our ports. And I missed it. If you ever miss it like I just did, it gives you that sort of out port for when we are linking frames together with overflow text. You can just hit escape. Obviously, you see I do it all the time. So again, let's adjust. There we go. And you adjust it the same way you would, if you kind of wanted that to be on the center top of our crazy shape, or you wanted the text to start here and have sort of this be the center point. If you wanted this to align, justify left and start here. You basically adjust it the same way. And when it goes over a curve, when it goes over more complex, not that this is incredibly complex, but when it goes over a curve rather than something straight, you'll see sometimes like this gets a little bit tight around this curve. So again, you'll need to adjust your kerning, which I know we've done before. Open up our character palette, and let's say we wanted to adjust the space. Let's say we find that space really, really tight, and we can adjust our kern there between the Y and the P and the T and the Y. I did a little bit more than necessary just to show you. So you can adjust. This is where, again, going back to our kerning and tracking from earlier in the semester, it comes in really handy, because you see as text flows around paths, it can tend to get squished or distorted, as the technical term. Lastly, I will show you converting text to outlines. So we're going to handle our text. I'm just going to select a nice bold font, and I'll make it massive so we can actually see it. There we go. So let's say we wanted to put an image or content of some sort within this text. We wanted to use that text as a frame. Right now it's type, and you can't do that. Pretty much all you can do is adjust the type, change the color, etc., etc. What we would do is we would select our text, and under type, we go to create outlines. I believe, I don't know if it does it in all the sections, there's one page where it says it's under object, create outlines, and it's not, it's under type. The book rather tells you, I believe it's under object. It might have moved. Generally, any kind of thing you're doing to type is going to be under text. So it's about a third of the way down, maybe. You select your text and you create outlines. And what that does is you'll see fundamentally it doesn't look much different. I'm just going to cut that out of our text frame that we had. And now you'll see if I take off that fill, now you'll see it looks just like any other frame. So now this is a frame that we can put content into. You can have text, you can have text flow into it, you can have images, you can place anything into that content, or any content into that frame just like you would any other, even if it was like a ellipse or a square or anything like that. So you can, let's go to file, place. Thought it was going to crash. File, place, and we'll find, hopefully, I don't know, arbitrary picture. And now we have that awesome picture within that text. And you can fit it just like the last assignment, just like any other. Fit the frame proportionally, fit content proportionally. You'll see the content. Remember how it fits whatever the height in this case is, so we have all this extra, so obviously we would go with fitting frame proportionally. So you can do any of the kind of frame fittings that you would with any other frame. So now we have this this text is now an object that we can, and you can apply a stroke. Oops. You can apply a stroke to it if you'd like, and adjust accordingly. It basically converts text into an editable, or rather into paths, rather than editable type. The one thing that I tend to do, if you're doing something simple like this, it wouldn't matter so much. But the one thing that I tend to do and incorporate into my workflow is if I have something like I don't know, if I have a word from a logo or something that I'm going to fill with an image, or I'm going to do some adjustments on or apply effects to or something like that, what I'll do is if I want to try it in upper or lowercase, what I'll end up making a copy of it like off to the side of my pasteboard, and I'll keep that type, like I'll keep that editable text, and then I'll make a copy of it and then outline that. So I always have that editable text to go back to. Like, let's say, I don't know, it happens all the time where like a client will say, you know, they want their logo established 1993. And then so you do all that work, you create outlines, you do all the fun stuff, whenever they go, oh, you know what, just put EST. And you're like, okay. And it's, I mean, that's obviously not that huge of a change, but this way I always have that editable text to go back to where I can go, okay, and then I can just delete, you know, edit my text as I need to, and then make another copy of that and then outline that later. I tend to incorporate that in my workflow. I see you know, I got that from a friend. I see a lot of people do that. So when you're converting, you know, if you're doing a simple project or some of our like our exercises from the book, having an editable copy isn't going to matter so much. But once you get into some more advanced things, some more advanced working and workflow, I find that leaving an editable version of your text off in your pasteboard comes in really handy. That's basically what I wanted to show you. For working with, I know that was kind of a lot, but working with our pen tool to create paths and create shapes, working with our shapes and our compound, and our pathfinder to create compound paths, more complex shapes, text on a path, and also converting text into a compound path in order to be able to use it as a frame for content.